Hello and welcome to the 2021 Cultures and Communities Festival presented by Freighter and the Medical College of Wisconsin. My name is Aster, my pronouns are she and they, and I am the genre queer programmer at Milwaukee Film. And I am very thrilled to welcome you to this panel discussion, Queering the Fandom. This event is associated with a film that I'm going to tell you about. It's called Queering the Script, and it is playing tomorrow, that's Friday, September 10th, at 4 p.m. at the Oriental Theater. And this film takes us into the world of LGBTQIA pop culture fandoms, looking at different practices like cosplay, fan fiction, and different forms of DIY, do-it-yourself culture. I would also like to plug one of the virtual films we have called No Straight Lines, which is playing virtually for this festival, and it is about the history of queer comic book creation. And as Milo reminded me, it's not just about superheroes. Queer comics are not just about superheroes, but there are queer superheroes. So at the heart of these cultural practices, and what we're going to be discussing here today, is this spirit of DIY creation, of self-authoring your own representations, your own narratives, and creating your own forms of media. And how does that relate to, say, commercial media? We're going to talk about that stuff here today. So without any further ado, I would love to turn it over to our two special guests, Bianca and Milo, and have you both introduce yourselves, what it is you do, and we'll start from there.
Sure. I'm Bianca. I've been a freelance graphic designer and painter for 10-ish years, I guess. I started getting into zines within the last 5 years as part of like a push to explore myself and queerness more. And I also do cosplay too, so was very excited to be invited to this panel.
I'm Milo. I'm also a graphic designer. I've been making zines since the early 1990s, and I'm the co-founder of the Queer Zine Archive Project located here in Milwaukee. So zine maker and also not really real librarian.
Perfect. And so, since you're both working in zines, we will get to cosplaying. But I would really love, to clarify for members of the audience, I would love to hear what exactly is a zine, and how do you define zines as DIY media? What is that for you? And if Milo, if you want to start, and then we'll go to Bianca.
And for us, zines are handmade publications. They're low cost in terms of how they are made and reproduced. You don't need any special skills to make a zine. Kind of anybody and everybody can make zines. They're usually, the creator is kind of in charge of the entire process from conception through execution to distribution, which is very different from how other media forms happen. What else? Yeah, I feel low print run, so less than 5,000, and 5,000 zines is a lot of zines, usually less than 100.
Yeah, I'd say things about zines to me too are also about like exploration and sharing information in like an easy, accessible way to whomever comes into contact with it. So, it can be self-expressive or sharing content for like educational purposes as well.
I should also point out that they, for the most part, are printed objects.
Mm-hmm.
So, especially within a 21st century context, there are e-zines and websites and things like that which are kind of on the fringe, but in this case I feel like we're talking about something that is tangible.
Yes.
Awesome. Before I dive into the next question, I just want to remind our virtual viewers that we will be taking questions eventually, so if you do have questions out there in virtual land, please send them in. So going back to the zine, I have a kind of broad question about why do zines matter to, say, minoritized, marginalized communities, LGBTQIA creators? But before we get into that broad question, I'll plan it now so we can stew a little bit, is I'd really love to hear how both of you got into this practice. Because this may be an assumption on my part, because I'm not a zine expert, but everyone I know who does zines is really seriously into them and has been for a long time. And I'm always curious to hear, how did you get drawn into this culture and this cultural practice of being makers and creators of zines?
Well, I guess even when I was little, I would sit down and narrate my drawings as I did them. So it was kind of more natural. Maybe some of mine kind of fringe onto like comic book kind of feels. But for me, like drawing and writing as I went was a self-expressive thing. And I kind of pushed that away for a long time to focus very strictly on like graphic design, painting and drawing. And then as I aged more and got to be part of the artistic community and see the gallery world, I kind of became disillusioned by a lot of the inaccessibility of it. So I started finding events that were more DIY, more hands-on, and more about like being accessible to different groups of people. So as I was exploring myself and my like becoming part of the queer community, I found that they kind of went hand in hand for me. And I started practicing excitedly, and now it's just a part of what I do as an artist. So.
Can I follow up real quick before we move to
Absolutely.
Milo? What is it about, what made them go hand in hand for you? Could you like expand on that a bit?
Well, it's like, it was about like sharing for me. So before, when I was like younger, when I would do these things, it was very like personal and in myself. And as I kind of came into contact with other people that were sharing this sort of content around and being expressive and vulnerable and, trying to inform other people about stuff I cared about, it became very natural for me to kind of fall into the swing of like repurposing that thought process in a way where I could show others and express those things to other people. And also to kind of deal with some of the like human experiences that I had. So it was just very natural for me to kind of want to draw again and storytell with it. And sometimes it's more abstract and sometimes it's more literal, but it's just part of the process for me now. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And Milo, how did you come to zines?
So when I was coming out in the early 1990s, zines were kind of an integral part of my queer and feminist community here in Milwaukee, and sort of on the edge of Riot Girl and like punk and alternative communities. Like this was all sort of getting bigger and bigger in 1992-93 when I first got started. And so I made a couple of zines with a friend for a couple of years, and then I put it away. And then when I finished up school, making zines was a way for me to keep my hand in doing graphic design, and sort of thinking about concepts, and having lived outside of Milwaukee and then being back here, trying to find a place to fit in and a community to connect to that wasn't necessarily connected to gay bars exclusively. And I joke sometimes that I started making zines because I felt like the loneliest queer punk in Milwaukee, which was kind of true at the time, and of course now I have access to 40 years worth of zines and recognize that there were other people making zines in Milwaukee at the same time, and we just didn't connect. But I feel like that was at least initially how I got involved.
Fascinating. And so I want to, before moving on to some other questions, I'd like to linger on this topic that you bring up, Milo, community. And Bianca, you also mentioned this community. And do you find, I guess maybe I'm reiterating some things back to you, so the zines kind of circulate as knowledge or information or sharing, but also are a way of building communities outside of different institutions. Like you said, for a lot of queer folks, sometimes bars and alcohol and partying is kind of like the only known community for many people for a while. How do you find that zines, do you find them building communities or kind of existing in pre-existing communities? Were you pulled into a community of zine making, or was it more individually driven by a passion to give something back to a community? I know it's kind of a jumble of little questions there about community, so I'll stop and say, I'd really love to hear your thoughts on more about zines and their relations to the communities that you engage in that read these materials.
I think for me, I came in contact with the community admittedly through fandom communities. I do go to anime conventions. I've gone to anime conventions for years, and I found a group of friends that would make fandom content, and found that a select group of them would also make zines. So I was intrigued by this and was like, oh well, this is a really interesting way to combine like graphic design and drawing and like storytelling and sharing content. And so I started going to events to seek that out. So I went to like Cake and some other like smaller zine fests to kind of understand what makers were doing and to try and like see if I could fill this kind of like hole in my creative process that I was really feeling. Because I was really feeling like my graphic design and my painting were two separate things, and like I was pigeonholed into either category. And I went to Cake one year, and it was just a bunch of like really cool queer creators melding all this stuff together, and they were all really friendly and talked to me about their process. And I just felt myself like fitting into that community really easily. So I decided I was going to start exploring this for myself. And I'm very happy I did that, because now like it kind of trickles in and you end up finding like friends in other areas that are also doing it. So it does kind of become like its own community. So, what about you, Milo?
I think, so zines were certainly a part of the community that I was already in. Sort of subculturally, they were around 1998 or so. I was kind of involved with a queer punk email list, and through that, you know, it was all text-based email. This was, you know, early web kind of stuff. But folks would post when they put up a new zine, or put out a new zine, and you could send away stamps or money or whatever. And so we were doing a lot of exchanging that way. And it was through those zines that I ended up meeting some folks in person who I developed relationships and friendships with. And one of those was my partner Chris, who had also been a zine maker, is still a zine maker. And from there, when we started the Queer Zine Archive project, we sort of grew into a community of librarians, for the most part, who are interested in looking at zines from sort of through librarianship. And often they're makers, but I feel like that in and of itself has become a huge community for us right now. And so we're mostly connected to people sort of in that way, and doing organizing around zine events specifically, I think. But I feel like in a broader context, zines absolutely are, you know, you had mentioned sort of information vectors, and for us, as we formed QZAP, that was really important. Like, we were doing other organizing work, and we had said, oh shit, somebody's written about HIV, somebody's written about accessibility, somebody's written about sex or gender or food or whatever. How do we share this information? How do we connect what people are writing about, thinking about in their own lives to a broader audience?
Yeah, that's really well said, and it makes me think of, as a trans person, one of the first exposures that I had to a kind of transsexual identity beyond commercial pornography was in zines that were shared among members of the community when I entered into graduate school, and was like, you know, this is what it could be to be trans, and that information just didn't exist anywhere else at the time. But thank you for those responses. I want to, I was trying to figure out the best way to ask this. I want to think about the forms of queer media that you both create in relation to, say, a larger commercial media? Because this is in theme with both of the films that I mentioned, Queering the Script and No Straight Lines, is that, and also coming from my background as a queer academic, is that so much of queer history often seems countercultural or oppositional or directly antagonistic to a mainstream culture. And we live in this really strange time where there is so much more queer representation than there's ever been in mainstream television. I'm like, every day now I see bank commercials with trans people in it, and it's like, this is kind of weird, but I also wanted this. Like, so I'm interested to hear, and Bianca, you can definitely throw in cosplay, because a lot of fan activities like cosplaying and fan fiction, they take something that is commercial and rework it for their own representations. But zines, and maybe I'm framing it incorrectly, do you see zines as in conversation with the mainstream culture, oppositional to it, doing its own thing autonomously? I would love to hear both of your thoughts on this kind of relationship between making zines, making self-created DIY art forms versus a kind of commercial backdrop that we all kind of live in.
So, I feel like for me, like my perspective very much is that when I look at a media landscape and I look at what it purports to be LGBT media or LGBTQ plus media, and I say purports very deliberately, the vast majority of it is white and homonormative and middle to upper middle class.
Mm-hmm.
And what gets created perpetuates that. It tends to, in the United States, it tends to be northern and city-oriented, and zines cut right through that, you know, because they happen everywhere and anywhere, and because, as we've said, they're easy to make, they're low budget, you know, as a way of storytelling. So if you pick up, and I guess people don't read magazines quite in the same way now, but I think about Out, or I think about The Advocate, or Girlfriends, and just going through and seeing who the articles are written for, and who's doing the advertising, and what's being advertised. And, you know, taking a little bit of a long view, standing in 2021, and looking back to the early 90s, thinking about how for a really long time, Out magazine was the biggest gay magazine in the country, and they only put straight people on the cover. You know, like, that tells you a whole lot about what it is. You know, seeing advertisements for commitment rings, or Olivia Cruises, or, you know, beach houses in Provincetown is so far removed from the experiences of most folks that I know. And I feel like zines, you know, they skirt around that completely, and they tell completely different types of stories. I think, additionally, now looking at queer media, Drag Race, or The L Word, or I don't know what the flavor of the month show on Netflix is, but I know that there's definitely one.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of the same thing all over again, in terms of who it's making money for, what the product placement is. And when we create our own media, we don't have to follow any of those rules, because we don't have editors, we don't have advertisers who we're beholden to. You know, and for me, I feel like that's really where zines become powerful. In the same way that queer film historically has had that power. You know, when we push away all of that, and you look back 35 years worth of LGBT film festivals, what stories are getting told, what actually comes up at a festival versus what hits the multiplex, you know, hugely different, right? To see Friends of Dorothy versus In and Out, as two terrible old examples.
No, great examples.
Yeah. Just to jump off that, I think it's this manufactured like concept of queerness that's not necessarily based in reality that you see from media a lot. I actually, I acted in like a commercial recently for an insurance company. And their whole goal was to make it as like inclusive looking as possible. So, you know, you had like the biracial couple with the dog looking at the chair, and then, you know, there was me who's also like visibly queer and plus size, and like an African American man. They're very much manufacturing this concept of like what queerness looks like, and it is, like, I agree, like very much like city oriented or like put in these industrialized areas. And I agree with Milo in that zines do skirt around that, like it feels like a more authentic representation of what the queer person wants to say or share or, you know, expel out into the world creatively. And I think that it's counterculture in that way, in that it's like actively debasing some of the perceptions that society still wants to put on to queer and gay people. So that's kind of what I would think.
And I think overall, you know, there is this sort of broad-based idea that we won. You know, because you can get married to somebody of the same gender within a somewhat limited scope, because we now have the privilege of serving openly in the military. You know, everything that our ancestors a generation ago who were dying of AIDS wanted for us has come true. And the fact of the matter is that this is not true at all. You know, and I think that these are the stories that zines are telling now that people don't want to hear. You know, they don't want to hear, why aren't you married? Why don't you think serving in the military is great? Why aren't you supporting capitalism in the way that we've been told that if we assimilate and if we do the thing and if we, it's okay that you come out, but as long as you come out and step in line, good job you. You know, and so it's finding materials, finding people who are writing and drawing and telling stories that aren't just a reaction, but they're a proaction towards something else, something that might be more utopic, at least, you know, sort of in somebody's heart, if not in our current reality.
Can I just jump off that?
Please keep going, yeah.
I think also that a lot of media that we have obviously is put through a filter of Eurocentric ideals. So when you're looking at zines, you're going to get it from, you know, Native folk, people of color, people who have been, you know, debased societally because of whatever orientation or film of, or not film, but like whatever like scope of oppression they're within. So you're getting a wider perspective, and you're not going to get that from a lot of US media. You know, they're just not going to show an accurate depiction of what it would be like to be like a native, you know, queer person in the US. And you can get that by talking to and purchasing from like a native zine maker, you know?
This reminds me of the famous Bechdel comic strip from, I believe it's from Dykes to Watch Out For. I can also plug the movie again, No Straight Lines, which features Alison Bechdel. But the one where, I think it's like the 1980s, and it's two dykes on the couch watching TV saying, I wish they had realistic depictions of us on television, and then the bottom frame is like the 2000s. The fashions are different, but they're saying the same thing. I wish they had realistic depictions of us on TV. So I guess pulling on that question, or the comments that you both shared, is that it seems that zines, DIY culture, self-representation of queer folk is still just as necessary, if not even more so, because there has been this widespread commercial acceptance of a certain kind of representation, but it's extremely narrow. And many of the base issues, and you know, my queer politics come from very anti-assimilationist politics, when queer also had a component of explicit anti-capitalism, and now the word means many different things. So zines are doing this kind of political work, and so do you see them also are they allowing spaces for like celebratory and generative creation? I knew the answer to that question, but I want to get you talking about it. And so I would like to hear some about how like these practices, these DIY practices are both simultaneously critiques of the system that is ignoring certain people, but also spaces for, would you say, pleasure, happiness, agency, the self-agency of the creators. And I would love to hear some about that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. A lot of the zines that I work on, and a lot of the writing I do for zines that might not be done yet, are celebrations of my body, for example. I'm a plus size person. I've always had that, and we are systemically debased for being plus size. And a lot of what I like to do is to celebrate my natural human form, and a lot of it is addressing fat phobia and violence against fat people. And also in, accepting, acknowledging, and loving my queerness, which was a hard thing for me to come out for initially. And zines have been such a uniquely celebratory way for me to be vulnerable, but on my own terms, which sometimes you don't get to make that decision. So.
I think, I fully agree with Bianca. Finding zines that celebrate people's whole lived experiences within their bodies, within their sex and sexuality, within their gender and how they present it to the world. It really is a celebration in that way. I think about some of the stuff that I've been focusing on making of late, and what sort of has been drawing me. And the zines that I'm most drawn to and that I've been trying to create within my own framework are, I like to joke and call them queer punk pop culture perzines that sort of have a 90s style. But I think about some mainstream magazines that aren't necessarily queer, like Rolling Stone or Spin, or things that really look at pop culture and pulling the queerness out of that and then elevating that. Digging around on Bandcamp, for example, and finding queer artists and writing about them and buying their music in the way that the zines of my youth were a way to find out more about, Riot Grrrl and queercore bands. And sort of using zines as that same medium now in the 21st century, and really sort of celebrating that and taking the time to say, oh, it's not something that I just saw flip by on Instagram. Somebody's taken 10 minutes to write a couple of paragraphs about what they just purchased and what they're listening to, or what their experiences have been with any given thing. And so I think that there is, because zines can and are about everything and anything, there's so much room for play and for joy.
Perfect. Beautifully said, both of you. There's something I want to pull out of that to ask a question, but first I just want to remind audience members here and virtually that we'll be taking questions if you have them, just as a reminder, so we'll turn to those momentarily. But Milo, something you said really hits on something that I wanted to discuss about queer fandoms or queer DIY culture, is that historically, queer folks have had to kind of work with a mainstream culture that doesn't represent them, but reworking that into something that does represent them. As an example, Film Comment recently had a great podcast about trans cinema with a number of trans critics and filmmakers. And one of the trans filmmakers said that they don't believe there is a trans cinema yet. Maybe it's being born, but so much of what trans viewership is finding representations in films that don't literally have trans people. And sometimes that is more pleasurable and engaging than some of the movies that we're given, right? That are like, here is some horrific depictions of how everything awful that's ever happened to a marginalized person, pay $10 to see it. And so I'd really love to hear your thoughts on this, expand on that, Milo, but also Bianca with cosplay, because so much of cosplay, especially queer cosplay, is maybe taking characters that are not queer coded and making them queer. For me, every X-Men is queer. No one can tell me otherwise. And if it looks like a straight relationship, they're trans. Like that's what it is, and that's how I engage with it. So I'd really love to hear a bit more from both of you about how, as creators, both in terms of cosplaying and zine making and graphic design, are you relating to or taking elements from things that already exist and reworking them to be something queer? Because that's a little different than self-authoring a queer representation that exists on its own outside of a mainstream culture. But I would love to hear more about this reworking our culture to fit your own needs or representations. Sorry for that kind of long-winded question there.
I mean, to get a little nerdy for a second.
Please get very nerdy if you want to. We're all nerds here.
So, I feel like it was 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, reading Grail Marcus's Lipstick Traces. And, Grail Marcus is a cultural critic and sort of an anthropologist. And he writes a lot about Dadaism and what happened in the 30s and what happened in 1968 and deternment and, taking something and literally reworking it. I think a real easy example is the classic Elvis Presley album cover versus the Clash London Calling. So we've taken an image and how all of that relates to punk specifically. And punk is hella queer and it's always been hella queer, right? So looking at that, looking at how queer activists and artists have been using deternment for multiple generations, and taking representational images and making them into something else. I feel like there's a very direct line from that to how queer zines sort of exist, and sort of where they started from in the late 70s and early 80s and sort of how they've expanded out. Just from a visual sense, like being playful, but also very, very pointed.
Yeah, so I'm gonna respond to this from a very different angle, but I was like a closeted kid in a small suburban town, and I was like one of 3 kids in my high school that liked anime. And if you've ever been a kid at a school who likes anime in the middle of nowhere during the 2000s, it was not a fun time. And I think, especially now, like being 30 and seeing like these new generations of kids growing up and having access to anime and having it be more socially acceptable now, I think that shipping culture has been a big part of a lot of like queer kids like coming out and understanding like who they are. And by shipping culture, I mean like pairing couples romantically that might not be canon or like written into the structural, basis of the story. So for me, that was one of the early ways that I was able to explore my queerness and understanding of like queer culture. And it might have been through like a heteronormative lens, but it still allowed me to very much like explore the fact that like I was definitely not straight, I was definitely not like cis, and a lot of kids get to be that more now, and I see it on like TikTok all the time, kids, cosplaying together as like these queer ships that they do. And it's just become like this very like accessible way for kids to explore like their sexuality, which is really great. And that's kind of like how I started getting into and understanding my gender actually, was by going and cosplaying. Because during high school, I kind of had to hide my interests, and when I went into college, I was able to kind of like save money, start to explore that stuff. And so one year I decided I was going to cosplay a character from like a very like famous dystopian 80s manga, and it's from Akira, and he wears this like leather biker jacket and everything, and I was like, I'm going to wear this outfit, I'm going to do this. I did it, and I felt so gender euphoric. And I hadn't had that in my entire life yet. I was very much like a hyper femme plus woman, because when you grow up like gendered as a girl and you're plus size, you're expected to be hyper femme in order to be considered like worthy or professional. That's just like what happens socially. And so like putting on that like red leather biker jacket and like biker boots was like just this moment of pure gender euphoria for me, and I didn't look back ever since. So I think like fandoms have been such an easy, accessible way for like kids and folks to like understand their gender. So I found like the zine community through the anime community because I met other people like me who were finding and exploring that through cosplay. And then, you know, those cosplay artists also would vend and have tables and sell their zines with like shipping and all these like great gay pairings. And it was just like a really accessible and friendly way to kind of like discreetly explore your sexuality. So it's kind of what I have to say on that.
I feel like one of the first pieces of gay erotica that I read was a Kirk Spock ship.
Yeah, absolutely.
And which makes me think that, you know, the origin of fanzines, as we know it now, really roots back to the 1920s and 30s with the creation of science fiction fanzines. And people would write and publish their own, and publish other people's work and circulate them. University of Iowa has a huge collection of old sci-fi fanzines as part of their zine library. And while that's never been my super interest, like I love that it has roots that date back almost 100 years of people self-publishing just for the joy of telling stories.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. I'll try not to go off on a tangent, but many of the early like commercially released science fiction magazines were edited and written by women and some like not out queer folk, and there was a concerted effort in the 40s when a new generation of most entirely male cisgendered men editors republished and just wrote them out of the history. And so many people forget that science fiction has been an extremely queer and extremely gender diverse genre since its inception.
Yeah, especially like Star Trek. You look at old photos of cosplayers, and a lot of them were girls. A lot of them were girls who were immersed in this fandom. And you know, we kind of like, there was a period where we'd write off like girls as like not being like cosplayers or like mocking them because like, oh, they're going to be a sexy cosplayer if they're a girl. But now like it's so inclusive in a lot of ways. Like, yeah, there are definitely issues in the cosplay community. Fat phobia is rampant. Black folks aren't like necessarily treated well because, you know, if they're a character that's white or another race and they're a black cosplayer, it's like, oh, you can cosplay that character. But cosplay has been a way for marginalized communities to explore performance and like appearance. And I just, yeah, science fiction is super queer.
Absolutely. DS9 was a big awakening for me. I think Odo was my first trans identification. So I want to put a pin on that for just a sec and see if we have any audience questions, either in person or virtually.
Nothing so far by here. I've told them to send them in.
Cool. We'll start thinking of those questions, virtual viewer land, and we'll come back to this. So I guess we'll just pick right up where we left off with that. I think. One thing that was mentioned in the email exchange, Milo, you had mentioned is talking about the queer zine archive that you work in, and I think it dovetails with what you were just bringing up, Bianca, about the different forms of policing and problematic aspects. Is this topic of, I guess, gatekeeping, and that like gatekeeping is different within queer communities, and you subvert like mainstream like heteronormative gatekeeping by doing the DIY culture. But I'm trying to think of this question in real time, I guess. What are your thoughts on that? on this issue of maybe gatekeeping within the community? Is it something that you see is done from the outside to queer folks, or the kind of queer fan community is pushing back against this in different ways?
You definitely see it within the queer community too. I'm trying to think, like, zines have been a very like accessible like area for me, but I feel like I see more gatekeeping in like cosplay and fandom for sure. especially in terms of like race and like body size discrimination still. I mean, I think we still see like idealized perceptions of, you know, partners in the queer community, and a lot of times like fatness is erased from that, people of color are erased from that. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on it, but I'm interested to see what Milo has to add.
I think that, I don't know if I would call it gatekeeping so much, but I feel like there are very strong perceptions of what queer people look like and what is attractive, what is, you know, sexually viable. And when you break that down into sort of various gendered components, the idea that, you know, if you're a man who's cruising for sex with another man, your profile may or may not say no fats, no femmes. And like this is sort of a hard-coded thing that gets brought up all the time, right? I don't quite know if that's the same within women loving women communities exclusively. I think my perception of trans bodies is that there's maybe a little bit more leeway, but when we look at idealized visions of trans folk right now, you know, we see folks who are pretty, there's a sort of normative body standard. Looking at the amazing folks who put out Pose, right? Mm-hmm. Like everybody in Pose is gorgeous.
Yeah.
You know, and they all have a very similar skinny body type. And I think that when we make our own media, we get to call what we want out and say, this is what I'm interested in. Mm-hmm. You know, I want somebody who's curvy. I want somebody who doesn't look like everybody else. I don't care if you go to the gym. I would prefer it if you don't smoke. You know, like, so I feel like we have this opportunity to put this out into the world, and also to talk way more freely about sex and sexuality and how we engage with other people in ways that are honest and consent-based and respectful and generous without being sort of pedantic, and that don't follow kind of the same scripts over and over and over again.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that, I think it's just, again, because it's removed from capitalism, that's what gives us a lot of space to do this. I don't know, like, my concept of cosplay is still rooted very much in there's a degree of expense attached to it, and then within a con framework, a lot of money is being spent. The idea, especially, you know, even if you're a smaller artist, you're hoping to make back at least your investment on a weekend kind of thing. And I feel like in zine culture, that's not always the point. Mm-hmm. And often that's never the point.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Yeah, there's certainly an elitism to the cosplay community that's really hard to get past a lot of times. And it can be rooted in, you know, racism, transphobia, fatphobia, all of that, you know, having access to money and not. I myself am usually pretty broke, so if I plan cosplay, like, it is a long-term investment, right? I'm building my prop out of foam and hot glue, and like, it is my week-time project that I'm doing. I'm not expecting to pay a ton because I'll take the time to do it slowly and procure everything. But there's certainly an elitism now, especially with it becoming a very capitalistic investment. You know, for some folks, this is their full-time job now. And, you know, there's this concept of competition in that community too that's really like volatile and not fun to deal with, because part of cosplay was supposed to be, you know, exploring and expressing your love for a character, getting to perform as them, getting to share that love and affection for that fictional piece that you love and connect with. But a lot of times it does become a contest. I've straight out told friends of mine who are thinner, conventionally attractive, benefit socially in different spheres than I do, that I will not cosplay the same character as them when they've invited me to do the same character. Because I've told them, you know, if you and I are cosplaying the same character, and I know you are asking me to do this with you out of love and excitement, you get to be the character, I get to be the fat version. And that is just the reality in the cosplay sphere. So I intentionally look for characters that I feel comfortable, confident, and expressive in. But there's, you know, it's a double-edged sword. You know, I can spend my money and do this, and it can have, like, no impact. Or I could be wasting, like, my energy and end up feeling, like, put down by the community for them, like, not liking how I look as that. And you definitely see that with, like, people of color and trans cosplayers, unfortunately. So, yeah, that is a very good point. It is not always an accessible thing to cosplay.
One of the things that I find really compelling about the zine communities that I have been part of for the last 30 years almost is that very much so, I think that there is, it's often unspoken, but sometimes it's very explicitly spoken, that there aren't rock stars in zine world in the same way that there might be in a cosplay world or in, you know, music world or film world or whatever. And so when people get written about, when they get anthologized by a third party, everybody is really supportive, but elevating somebody's work doesn't diminish from everybody else's work, which is really different from how a lot of other types of culture and counterculture exist. And so, like, I always feel really kind of good about that. You know, hanging out with folks who are definitely big names and not feeling weird or awkward. You know, because they're just making work like you are.
That's fascinating. So more of like a network of artists or fellow practitioners.
Yeah.
In the sense of the community. That kind of dovetails into a thing I wanted to ask Bianca based on what you just shared, and also Milo, please feel free to jump in. Do you see a more concerted effort among, say, queers, LGBTQIA folks in cosplay and the convention world to push back against this kind of hyper-competitiveness? Do you see any spaces where that's kind of like, we don't do that here? Or is it more like your individual experience navigating these things? Is it still at that kind of individual phase, or do you see more organized attempts to move away from that?
Actually, I'm gonna say both.
Okay.
There are certain conventions I've been to that are just really bomb at incorporating inclusion. And C2E2 is one of them. If you ever get a chance to go to a convention, that's the one I suggest, because it's comics, it's anime, it's video games, but they have such a good, like, team of folks who develop programming that is very queer-centric. And they get, you know, professionals in the field, they get, like, new artists, like, I'll go for the full weekend and every panel I'll go to will be about queerness or about inclusion or about, like, you know, trans accessibility in, you know, fandom. And it's just like, it can be a whole weekend of, like, exploring all of those things. But I'd say the overwhelming majority of conventions I've been to, they don't necessarily make as concerted of an effort to be inclusive. And also, C2E2 is one of the few that I've seen that makes very, very active attempts to stop, like, harassment on their floors. Because you'll see in the cosplay community that it does have, like, sexual harassment pretty prevalently, especially if you're a woman, femme, or wearing, you know, feminine cosplay, you tend to get harassed sometimes. So there are cons that I think are making very concerted efforts to be more inclusive and to stop harassment or, I guess just harassment is the best way to put it, at their cons. And they also, I think, do a really good job of like inviting smaller creative like cartoon artists and illustrators, especially like ones that focus on like POC stories or like queer stories too. So I would say that like certain conventions, depending on their team, have been working really well, but you're not necessarily going to see it like in Anime Milwaukee or something. So it really depends. I think that there's a push being made by the folks attending to get those changes made. You know, because I mean, we wouldn't see folks pushing back against harassment if harassment wasn't happening and folks were finding it unacceptable. So they let it know, like, we're not coming back unless you make a policy on this. And so then you start to see those changes, but yeah, because I mean, a lot of cons won't do anything if they don't see that that need is there, unfortunately, so.
Within zine event spaces over the last probably 5 to 10 years, we've seen a really wide adoption of safer spaces and braver spaces policies that say this, we want everybody to feel welcome, and also we're not going to put up with anybody's bullshit.
Yeah.
And that cuts in a whole lot of different directions. And for the most part, if you're participating as a zine maker, as somebody who might be a panelist or giving a workshop or whatever, everybody sort of buys into this, and you know, before you're allowed to register, you have to go through and read through the policy and initial a couple of times kind of thing. And I think that this is also, you know, it sucks, but it comes out of a need for us to create spaces where we say, we're not going to put up with it. And we're the ones who are making this space for ourselves. So there's no reason that we should have to put up with it. And if you don't like it, take a hike.
Yeah, just to add on with that, I know that like the anime community in particular has been seeing, especially with the Me Too movement, a lot of voice actors and guests that traditionally would come to the cons have been outed as predatory towards convention attendees. And I myself have witnessed that. You know, there are convention owners who have allegations against them, and it's just, you kind of have to do your research on, you know, who's a predator in that space, which is unfortunate, but I think that, you know, ties in because it's not the kind of space, like a zine making space. It's not a space where it's just, you know, predators are able to go in there because like you do have like a lot of privileged folks in power who are able to run the event, and they might have allegations against them, but they try to hush it. And so conventions on a whole, I think, are getting better. They are nowhere near as like safe as like a zine event, I would say.
And I think my perception is it's also a question of the space itself. Because cons, comic events, you know, cosplay events tend to take place either in convention centers or hotels or
Lots of people.
You know, lots of people that are in spaces that are also somewhat public.
Yeah.
Whereas zine events tend to take place in much smaller venues, you know, public libraries or, you know, VFW Hall, community center, a space like Woodland Pattern, and for a small event kind of thing.
There's also like a big drinking and rave culture, which does also end in other, you know, instances of violence at cons too. And if you got folks staying in the hotel rooms attached to the con, like that creates another level of, you know, barrier breakage that, you know, abusers can take advantage of. You know, if you've been drinking, you can end up in a room with someone, and that's just unfortunate. And you're right, the space does very much like prevent that, I feel like, at zine events.
Yeah, this seems like kind of maybe draw this topic to a close so we can get to some of the things before I run out of time. Is that it? To me, what I'm hearing is that this is like an extension of queer folks kind of building the culture that they want and that they need, in the same way that we've been talking about zines as DIY culture, kind of infiltrating and transforming the convention world from the inside out based on this kind of organized pushback. Seems like another really interesting example of like doing it yourself to create the spaces that are safe. Frustrating that that is necessary and a constant struggle, but an interesting aspect, which I appreciate you both sharing those experiences. Before we move to some like wrap-up questions, in the interest of time, I want to give a last call to any audience questions.
Nothing, but somebody did say they appreciate this conversation so much.
Those are always great comments. So I guess before moving into the end here, I did want to give more space to both of you if there were topics or things that you wanted to discuss or bring up in this conversation that we didn't get to. And it's cool if there isn't. No pressure.
I think that, like, for me, I think, like, vulnerability in zine development is a big thing for me. It's a big reason of why I got into it, because, like, I have survived traumatic experiences and I needed an outlet to, like, express that and expel it. And I've found zines to be, like, a very effective, tangible way to, like, share that for folks who might benefit from it. And I'm not saying I'm trying to, like, trauma dump on folks, but I am saying that there are ways to talk about societal situations or, like, addressing CPTSD or, like, other traumatic events that folks are going through. And I've myself has found a lot of solace from other zine creators who've been working in themes of, like, addressing mental illness and, like, accessing, like, mental health resources and physical health resources as a plus person. And, like, there are just so many different avenues that creators can take to make the world safer for other people. And I just find that to be one of the most amazing aspects of zines. And I think we spend a lot of time talking about, like, accessibility and, like, being able to share with everyone, but, like, a lot of it is also just, like, sharing the stories of the people who make the zine. And I think that's what makes it so unique to me. But
yeah, I think that's certainly a draw for us. Thinking about zine content, you know, especially in a conversation that's ostensibly, or started ostensibly to be about fandom. You know, when I think of fanzines, I think of people writing love letters to the pop stars who they are enamored with, and you know, my friends who put out a Buffy fanzine, and you know, my own fanzine stuff. But you know, I think that there's also this huge aspect of the idea of a personal zine. And, you know, when we talk about using a platform to elevate our own voices, you know, especially outside of mainstream media, people who are writing about their experiences growing up in Appalachia or being, you know, black and queer in Oakland and struggling with mental health issues, or even, you know, where we have zines that are on sort of the personal but informational side of things, you know, where people are writing about sexual health, they're writing about how do I access contraception, how do I access birth control, how do I access resources, and having that information being passed hand to hand. You know, I mean, we're ostensibly adults now, but for folks who don't get good sex ed in this country, having those resources, having some kid give you something in the locker room that you then pass on to your friends, and sure, you might laugh at the illustrations, but, you know, it also says, hey, if you need to contact Planned Parenthood, here's how you do it.
absolutely.
You know, like, hugely valuable, and, you know, I feel like this is something that we don't see in other aspects because we're not talking about some of this stuff in mainstream media, right? Like, nobody says, oh, high school student over there, you know, you're having sex, here's how to do it in a
Yeah.
way that is going to be good for your mental health, here's how to negotiate consent, here's how to, you know, you like somebody of the same gender, you don't know what gender you are. You know, if you brought this up in any other media form, there would be this, you know, basic piling on as you're terrible, you're predatory, you're whatever. And so, you know, we're able to navigate and negotiate that in ways that just can't be done in our current landscape.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and thinking about how many people's, as you say, like, when you read somebody else's story and you connect with them, right? We were working on a research project a couple of years ago with a queer elder who was interested in zines and interested in our collection at QZAP. And after a couple of weeks of working with them, the light bulb went on, and we were in a meeting, and like you could see it go from like 15 watts to 300 watts, and they're like, oh, people find your zines and they see themselves reflected in it. They come to your collection to learn about themselves. And by learning about themselves, they're then able to share their stories so that they can help other people learn about themselves. And like that's, you know, I feel like that's really the power of queer zines.
That is so beautifully put, and I think it really, like, hopefully. Ooh.
There's a question.
Oh, then I will shut my mouth and listen to this question.
Okay, so regarding zine culture as a dissent or counterpoint to celebrity or capitalist pop culture, do you feel zine culture is inherently safe from commodification or assimilation, or are there threats to zine culture that we should worry about?
That's a question. That's a good one.
I don't know that I have a super good answer. I think that you know, I feel like people make attempts at commodification. A couple of years ago, Kanye West put out a zine, and kind of everybody that I know looked at it and was like, that's not a fucking zine, what are you talking about? Whatever, you have millions of dollars behind you, and I don't care what your intention is. So I don't know that I necessarily see that as a threat. I think that there's a lot of space to explore. And I also think most folks that I know who are part of the zine community are really not interested in gatekeeping and saying that is or isn't a zine. You know, like if you put something out in the world and folks are interested in it, then they're just not interested in it, you know, and it's not my job to say, oh, that is a zine or that isn't a zine. You know, and I think that at least within library land, within zine academia, you know, there's not a sense of shaming or pushing back against that. I think that there's maybe, you know, there's some critique. We were talking a little bit earlier about accessibility in terms of production value and pricing.
Yep.
And if anywhere I can see that being part of the conversation, what is a zine, what isn't a zine?
Yeah.
You know, if it's glossy and it's being distributed by Urban Outfitters and it has pictures of somewhat normative cis men having sex with each other, is it a zine because it's being distributed by Urban Outfitters? That's not for me to say. You know?
Right.
I don't know if I necessarily would call that a zine, but I also, you know, I'm not going to say no.
Right. It's a tricky question, for sure. I think also it gets into the topic of like, what is an artist book or art book versus zine too, especially with you mentioning like Kanye. I have no idea what his zine would have looked like, but I'm really having a hard time picturing him making like a very like printing it off and like his laser printer and like stapling it and kind of like accessible zine. So like, I don't know, I don't currently feel any like threat from commodification in the zine world. It feels very DIY still to me, but yeah.
And I have the same question about artists who put out mixtapes. And I'm like, you have a huge label backing you and you put out a mixtape. Does that mean that it's actually a cassette that you're selling out of the boot of your car? Like, I hope, because my head does kind of what a mixtape is, but
Right.
I don't know, it's not currently part of my subculture, so I haven't had a lot of energy to explore it, but I feel like it's a similar type of question.
No, for sure.
Which might have been a complete non-answer to that, I don't know.
I wonder if hearing both of your responses to that question, the aesthetics can be assimilated, but the intent and the network, the
Yes.
community can't, because it's always in an oppositional position to capitalism.
Yeah.
But we've seen like DIY punk stuff almost immediately became a capitalist style, but that didn't kill the punk attitude.
I certainly feel that, a graphic designer for a big publication could go to a zine event, look at things and try to incorporate, the design aesthetics of what they saw there. But, I don't necessarily think that makes it a zine, But I think you have something there where they can reappropriate zine aesthetic. But there's so many different ways to make and design zines that, like, what is zine aesthetic? Maybe Milo can speak on that better, but...
And that's all over the map, right?
Right, it's everywhere, yeah.
Like a zine, so we have everything in our collection from illustrations by 6-year-olds
Right.
to things that are super slick and professional, that definitely had some budget, but by virtue of the fact that the content is something that is challenging, maybe dangerous, and it's meant to tell a story, it's meant to be accessible in a different way. So, I feel like it's kind of all over the map. And it takes a lot of skill to make something look shitty.
Yeah.
Like, if you're a designer,
Absolutely.
if you're a designer,
It really does.
to get that zine aesthetic, like, you kind of have to really know your photocopiers and slave over them to get them to look degenerated.
Yeah,
like
that's
that.
a really good point. No, absolutely.
Any other late coming questions?
No, just a thanks from the question asking.
Thank you.
Your answers were great. I guess in the sake of time, moving towards wrapping up, is that all right? Cool. Thank you both very much. I want to give you both an opportunity before we end to, if you want to, are you working on any projects now that you can share with us, and how can people find you or support the work that you're doing?
So I sell 2 zines on my website right now, but I've got multiple stuff in the works. Sorry for crinkling people. But both of these are kind of self-expressive, mental health kind of stuff. I sell them on my website, biancabrandolino.com, and I have an Instagram under the same name. But I'm currently working on some more zines, some lighthearted ones, honestly, and then some body positivity, more fat acceptance stuff, because I tilt more that way than body positive. And also just I paint and make jewelry in my spare time, so you can find that on my website too.
And what was the website again?
BiancaBrandolino.com.
Awesome. Thank you. Milo?
And my stuff, some of my old work or older work can be found, and not just my work, but the work of hundreds of queer zinesters can be found at qzap.org, which is qzap.org. And from there, you can read our blog posts and go to the archive, and
Awesome. Well, with that, I want to thank you both for being here today, and I thought this was a really amazing conversation, so thank you both so much for taking the time and sharing your work and sharing your ideas. I think it's really, really important work that you're both doing, putting your labor into these zines, putting them out there, archiving them, so thank you so much for that. I also want to give a big thanks to the audience, everyone here in person and virtually, and also thank you so much, Woodland Pattern, for hosting this. This is a wonderful space. For those of you watching virtually, you should come here, it's really rad. support this business. And with that, thank you everyone for coming out to the 2021 Cultures and Communities Festival. And if you wanted to watch the films that we referenced about these topics, just a reminder that Queering the Script is playing one time only at the Oriental Theater, and that's tomorrow at 4 p.m. And they talk a lot about a lot of the topics Bianca and Milo brought up about these fandom communities. And also No Straight Lines about the history of queer comic books, which is fascinating, and you can watch that virtually. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.